This podcast provides a platform to discuss important questions and complex issues, challenge the status quo, and confront the boundaries of the establishment. I'm retired police chief Daniel Hahn. I went from being arrested at 16 to serving over 34 years in law enforcement. My goal is to keep you informed with news not being reported, voices not being heard, and the untold history of how we got here so that we can create a way forward. Welcome to A Way Forward. I have a very, very special guest today, and I don't want to do her a disservice, so I want to make sure that we all understand what kind of trailblazer, amazing person that's with us today. Today we have Miss Jonni Redick, who was a retired assistant chief from the California Highway Patrol, which, by the way, is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in our country, with over 7,500 sworn officers and a total of over 11,000 employees. A 29-year veteran rising through the California Highway Patrol ranks from county clerical worker to breaking through the less than 1% ceiling for women of color in executive leadership positions in law enforcement. She was the first female captain in the Contra Costa CHP area in Martinez, California. And as assistant chief, she worked in the Golden Gate Division in the San Francisco Bay Area as part of the executive oversight of 16 field commands with over 1,600 personnel that worked in 9 Bay Area counties and over 100 cities and over 7 million in population. She has been an incident commander for critical incidents, civil disturbances, mutual aid events, and coordination of natural disaster response and oversight. She's also a member of many organizations, of which some we are both members of: the International Association of Police Chiefs, of Chiefs of Police, National Association for Women Law Enforcement Executives, American Association of University Women, and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, of which she's the chairperson of the Safety and Wellness Committee. So this is somebody that's done a lot, but isn't done. She's still doing a bunch of stuff. She just recently published 2 books. One, her leadership memoir called Black, White, and Blue, Surviving the Sifting, and also another book called Survival Guide to Law Enforcement Promotional Preparation. And we will definitely talk about these books before we get done. But welcome, Jonni.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a kind introduction. So thank you.
Well, could have gone on for a lot longer, but I figured I'd try to cut it a little bit short. So with somebody that has blazed some trails and been places where not too many people like yourself have been before, especially in law enforcement, tell me a little bit about your upbringing and eventually what prompted you to go into a profession where you surely didn't see people that looked like you, especially in high positions. So tell me a little bit about how you grew up and what made you want to get into law enforcement.
Well, I'm just going to be transparent and say before we actually went live, I told you where I grew up and you giggled.
It was a good giggle.
It was a good giggle. But so I grew up in California and I grew up in Bakersfield. For those in California, it's in the Central Valley. And I was raised by a single mother. My mother struggled quite a bit during our time financially. She struggled with addiction to drugs. She was a registered nurse most of her life. So when I came along, it was prescription medication at that time. So, working shift work, trying to stay up for shifts, needing to sleep, working through registries. When she wasn't working, because she was going through depression, we would be on welfare. We would live with family. We would live in Salvation Army. We live in the car. We live in a room. I mean, it was just very hectic for many of my younger years before I was a teenager.
Wow. We
were transient. We lived in different states. Depending on where her sisters were living is where we would go and stay for a while. Or, when I even think back to some of those spots when I'm asked to, rethink of your journey, I don't know how we did what we did and how we made it through what we did without, for me, God. And so I am anchored in my faith as I began to navigate my journey, I learned about that space that I needed for me to be able to, I don't know, help me to be stable, because there were so many opportunities for me to go in so many different directions.
Absolutely, and we see it every day in our community.
Every single day. I mean, and so, when I got to high schools, when I kind of started settling down for myself as well, where I was like, I don't want to go anymore, Mom. I don't want to go to Texas or Idaho or, Arizona or wherever she was going to be traveling. And I wasn't a great high school student. I think I was mediocre at best. I was striving to be better, but it was complicated. I was carrying so much trauma that I didn't even understand. And I met a family when I was about 8 years old the first time, a young girl I went to school with in the fourth grade. And we became friends. And her family became kind of my surrogate family when my mother could not function for me like she needed to.
Right.
So when I came back at 13 to Bakersfield, we had phone books back then.
Yes.
And I looked up
remember
in the
those.
phone book the last name of the family, and
Oh, so you hadn't had contact with them for a little bit.
for a long time.
Okay.
And I called the number because her name was her father's name, just slightly differentiated, and there was only so many in the phone book. And I called them, and they were like, "Oh my God, where have you been? We have to see you." And I integrated myself into that family because they took me in, and
Wow.
they are like my sisters and my second mother, because again, my mother struggled, right? You need community to be able to help you navigate. And so fast forward, I'm 18, I'm graduating high school, and I graduate, but I don't know what I want to do. So I go to apply for a job, and I get a job with human resources for the county as a typist clerk. And I take some junior college. And I'm working for social workers who are seeing cases. So occasionally I would see names of those I went to school with coming across. And I was like, man, I got to do something with myself. And I saw an ad in the paper.
So you kind of saw yourself in some of those names,
sure-
like potentially I could be.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I could be in the system. Absolutely. I just happened to have a clerical job getting paid $3.75 an hour, where I have a
That
few
wasn't
benefits.
bad back then. People today will say that was horrible.
Yeah, but that gives you perspective
Right,
on where we've
right.
come from.
Right.
And probably about 20 and a half, I saw a huge ad in the newspaper. I'd been with the human resources there for a couple years, and California Highway Patrol was hiring. And I was like, okay, the qualifications weren't that stiff. They're very similar to what they are: high school diploma, age requirements, vision requirements, no felonies, et cetera, driver's license that's valid.
What was your impression of law enforcement when you were growing up with all the moving around, or were you kind of neutral, or did you have a negative impression, or was it?
I was neutral.
Neutral.
I was relatively neutral. Whatever my mother was experiencing, I didn't always experience, because I would be left with family, and I wouldn't see her for days or weeks sometimes. So whatever might have happened, I didn't necessarily see it.
Gotcha.
As a young person, the only couple of instances that I had with law enforcement were not negative.
Okay.
But I had nobody in law enforcement. I had nobody in military. The only
Hear that
service-oriented,
story over and over.
the only service-oriented person I had was my mother when she was nursing. And she was nursing. I would see her in those strong leadership moments helping people. Okay. And so the ad was right next to the comics, which I love to read, and that's why it caught my attention, because it was a huge ad. And I was like, $40,000 a year, and I'm going to be able to go to a real dentist with real benefits, and it has something called retirement, which I didn't really understand what that meant, but I was like, man, that would be kind of a cool thing to have one day.
So it sounds like a little stability.
Sounds like a little stability
was attractive to you.
that I never saw, never had.
Right.
And so I applied because I had no history of anything in my background. Literally within 6 months, I had background investigators come into the house to talk to me and my mother to say, hey, can she go to we're going to extend the invitation to go to the academy in literally like 2 months in December.
Did the fact that you were a woman give you any pause about applying, or that never really crossed your mind at that time?
Honestly, maybe I was that naive, but no, because I played basketball in school.
Okay.
I was kind of like a tomboy growing up a little bit, rough and tough. But I did have a period where I modeled for a little while.
You
So
had a little bit of everything.
yeah, so people didn't think that why would you want to do it, for one? Two, what makes you think you can or should do it? And this came from my people that I was working with at the Human Resource.
So they weren't encouraging.
They were
kind
not
of
encouraging.
discouraging.
They were very discouraging. And when I decided to take the offer and I'm getting ready to leave, my goodbye gift was some weird watch that they gave me that if you wore it underwater, you could go so far deep because they heard there was diving in the pool.
the Highway Patrol.
At the Highway Patrol. But they also said, your job will be here when you don't make it.
Wow. When not if you don't make it, but when you don't
When
make
you
it.
don't make it, your job will still be here. So
Did you kind of realize what that was at the time, or you kind of just
I
blew it off?
didn't think it was necessarily so deeply rooted. I thought they just didn't think that I could do it.
Okay.
And nothing more to it. But every time I would come home to visit family, I would stop by. Every time I promoted, I would stop by. And
In your full uniform.
I didn't that would be nice, but to remind them that not only did I do it, but I was successful while I was there, and to let them know that I would have liked them to be more supportive, and it wasn't entirely all of them. I had one or two that were like, "You got this, girl. You can do this," but to remind them that you don't have to be stuck in your own mindset that you have, maybe even for yourself here.
Right.
And so I didn't go in and brag about it. I just showed up, and then they would ask me how things were going. And I would share that narrative because I found that there were people in that agency that they were still typist clerks. Mm-hmm. They weren't even looking for their own upward mobility right there.
They might have very well thought they couldn't do it themselves.
Yeah. So it's kind of my origin story of coming up is kind of wrapped around that journey of my life as a child, in my childhood, and discovering the Highway Patrol just incidentally, and then of course being influenced by Chips and things like that on TV. You
Poncherello.
Yeah, you want to kind of be cool. You're like, I want to be cool like them.
So, and I'm guessing your childhood and seeing your mom go through those things, and the fact your mom was a nurse, I would imagine heavily influenced you as a peace officer in the work that you did in the communities that you worked in.
Very much so. So when I said there wasn't very many champions or people that really thought it was something for me, my mother wasn't somebody who was surprised by the idea. She was more like, Jonni, you can do anything you want to do. So even though I felt like, daughters and mothers already have different relationships as they go through, come into their own, so to speak. But my mother and I had even more than that because of our journey, of her not being around a lot. And I was just angry. I didn't understand. I didn't know her own stuff she had to deal with. I just saw them for what I did as a young person. And so for her to be that one that said, you can do it, I trusted and believed her that I could do it. Now listen, when I got to that academy and they were yelling at me on day one,
Start having your doubts?
I was like, what in the world? Because there was no real recruitment of me. There was really no preparation of me.
And nobody you knew to give you a heads up of what to expect.
Nothing. Other than they said, you need to start running and get physically ready for the academy. So I started doing that. But when I got there and they started yelling at me and telling me I needed to go home and bake cookies with my mama and darling, all them, because when you show up dressed with your suitcases. You're going to have to get rid of all that, costume, makeup on your face and your ear, all of this stuff. And then I was like, what have I gotten myself into? Because I'm not military in any fashion, but I had the discipline of playing basketball for several years in high school.
And back then, coaches used to yell at you.
Coaches yelled at you. Workouts were hard. And if you wanted to play, you wanted to start, whatever that, all of that teamwork. And so you just kind of started to assimilate. But what I appreciated was those folks that you go to the academy with that see you. And then because it's predominantly white male, there was not very many women, not very many people of color, but you have good advocates that are, your allies that step forward for you for the right reasons and help you to succeed. Because without them, I would have went home and baked cookies with my mama. But my mama is key because we had pay phones, and so you could make phone calls home, right? Because we didn't have cell phones and pagers.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're saying we didn't have cell phones back then.
We didn't.
Yeah.
And every time I would call, embarrassed a little bit because I was getting emotional because it was very hard, long days, long hours, very much a lot of rigor. She would listen to me, and I would cry sometimes a little bit, and then she would just say, "But you're gonna stay, and you can do it." She said, "Try to get sleep." She didn't give me no, and that would stay her mantra my whole career of, you're gonna stay and stick it out, but get the rest you need, because it actually gives it frees your mind to free yourself from what you think you can't do when you rest and restore, to be like, it's a new day, I got this. And I would just every day, literally take every day for every day through that academy. But my mother was that person that believed in me to do the thing I didn't know that I could do.
It seems like what you're telling me sounds very familiar to my own personal experiences in the academy anyway, because everything you described was what I was thinking, because I went through that same location for SACPD's academy. Remember vividly the yelling, and I'm thinking, what the heck? Who are you yelling at? But you mentioned calling your mom, and with all the challenges you mentioned that your mom was going through in your childhood, she's still the person you were needing to hear, and she was still mom, right?
Yeah.
She's still a driving force of how you become successful despite all the challenges that the two of you had gone through in your youth. You also mentioned something else, that all these people in some form or fashion either didn't support you or in some way were even discouraging in assuming that you couldn't make it, which at the time doesn't seem terribly unusual that somebody would think you couldn't make it, because they probably didn't see too many yous in those roles. But you also mentioned there was a couple people that even sometimes on the down low were like, you can do it, and were kind of your encouragers. And it sounds very familiar to, we had Flossie Crump, who was the first female officer and also African-American in the Sacramento area. And these stories always are amazing to me, that you have all these people fighting against you and all this history and everything else going against you, and yet you're all very positive about the departments that you work for. You're still doing a lot of stuff in regards to law enforcement. And there was always some of those people that I guess you could say went against the grain and supported you. They mentioned those people, white males, are discriminating against them, but then there's these other white males that help them. So talk a little bit about, in your career in the Highway Patrol, some of your biggest challenges and some of your biggest successes over the span of your career.
That's a great question, but and it's kind of broad for a reason, right. So when you say challenges, quite honestly, for me, my biggest challenges was myself. And we talk a lot of times about imposter syndrome, that lack of confidence that we have when we show up. Are we worthy? Are we qualified? And that could be from conditioning and environmental influences, whatever that may look like, those factors. But for me, a lot of times I would get in my own head on if I should compete, if I should participate, if I mattered. And there was a lot of work I had to do on myself. And what I discovered is, as I built my competency in areas, it built my confidence. So I could sit on the sidelines and I could complain and say how I wasn't allowed to participate or compete or promote or get an assignment. But if I also did not do the work to prepare me to be selected for those positions, to be able to acquire the thing that I thought I should get, then that's on me. And it took me a while to figure that out. But once I did, I started understanding what I needed to do to be able to position myself better so that when those opportunities came along, they weren't going to be challenges for me. So like I said, I came on with a high school education. It got me where I needed to go for the first probably 7 years of my career. But when I started thinking about promoting, which nobody really planted the seed for me until I met, one of my captains who became our commissioner, who made me think about that.
And who was that?
Commissioner Joe Farrell.
Oh, okay.
Yes. He was the person that planted that seed for
Joe's
me.
still in the profession
And
to this day.
Joe is the man, okay?
Yes, he is.
Because he saw us all as individual people, and he humanized us even in our own department versus just being employees that you walk past, aren't necessarily overly significant to you if you're a commander and maybe you're passing through this command to go to another one, because again, we're a large state agency and a lot of people don't stay very long. They're on their own promotional journey. And so he planted that seed of that awareness for me of just how unprepared I was, although I felt like I was entitled to things.
Right.
And so for me, the challenges of discovery for me, and then challenges relative to structural barriers in the organization and people, some of them were personality conflicts. Some of them were people who simply wanted to select people that were like themselves. So if it's predominantly white male in leadership, they're picking predominantly white males to come along and be their whatever, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, chiefs. And then, for me, I didn't really feel like challenges existed necessarily discriminating against me. I just always saw them that they were based on relationships for people, because
It's a good way to think about it, right?
because when you look at culture and the culture of policing, it's very tight knit, and that's how a lot of things manifest. Is the way I would see them, and perhaps there was specific biases, but they were never something that and this is just me, like I said, that I was overtly feeling when I was seeking promotions. Now, when I was an officer and a sergeant, yes, there were overtly discriminatory and racist people on the department because they would say those things back then, right to your face, right in briefing. And the supervisor and manager wouldn't skip a beat and would keep on doing administrative work, would continue to operate like this is just the
Even
norm.
in California? That's not in
Even
the
in
South,
California.
right? It's California?
This is California. This is California. And I mean, I'm working in, Los Angeles area along
Very diverse area.
Ventura. I'm in, Ontario. I'm in, these areas, and Hayward, the Bay Area. And you would sit right in these briefings and they would refuse to ride with you if they had to ride with you on graveyard. They would call you all kinds of names and be like, you know what? And if you're going to make me ride with that bee, I'm going to go home sick. Wow. And they were like, well, okay, you guys are going to ride 3 to a car over here then so that this person wouldn't have to be impacted.
Wow.
And
I'd imagine when you did get promoted, there was probably some, because I experienced this myself, that the only reason you got promoted was because you're a woman, or because the color of your skin or something like that.
Okay, but I'm going to take it a step further for you, Daniel. Or you slept with them.
Well, that would be, I never got that. That would be something for a woman.
Because I'm a woman.
Yes.
Okay.
Not because of your abilities.
Not because of my abilities or my skills.
Right.
And so, I mean, even being a sergeant here in the Valley in Stockton, I had officers that would usurp my authority quite often, simply because they were senior to me when I came back, because I was an officer with them. Mm-hmm. They barely tolerated that, some of them, not all of them. I had really good people I worked for and with. But you would have those that I would come back, and now I'm leading them, and they would just literally not speak to you at all, hardly take your direction or order, just enough where you couldn't really write them up. You could have a conversation with them and they could maintain that level of just being in the room with you. But I mean, and I've constantly have felt my whole career that I had to constantly prove myself. When I came over to the Valley in Stockton from the Bay Area, investigations became a lot more complex than they were in the Bay. So when you're doing traffic investigations and other things, they weren't as complex. It was, a little bit simpler. It's much more complicated today than it was when I was coming up. But then when I came to the Valley, we have so much unincorporated area that we cover that's not freeway.
Right.
We're doing investigations like the sheriff department.
What people don't know is the Highway Patrol does the traffic enforcement typically in the unincorporated areas.
And we do general law enforcement, which is everything municipal agencies do and the sheriff department do. And so it would take a while before my partners would respond to my incidents.
To back you up.
To back me up.
Which is a safety issue.
Which is a safety issue. Until I could prove that I could do the work. And I could sound confident and competent. And then finally, one day in a hallway, one of the old timers, he had the full on white hair looking like Santa Claus, because that's usually what the top senior board looked like back then. We age much differently today.
Now we don't have gray hair.
But he said, hey, some of us were wanting to extend an invitation to you for after shift to come on over and have a soda. And a soda is, choir practice.
Right,
I was a non-drinker, but a soda. And it was a pivotal moment to say, I could be like, no, thank you. I'm just going to go home to my family. Or I could say, how can I leverage this relationship so that I can now have the support I need when I'm working, and for them to get to know a little bit about who I am versus just seeing me based on my gender, maybe based on my race. And it was significant because I used that in my leadership moving forward.
Awesome. So that is, I think, one, enlightening for a lot of people. But with all those challenges, you still stuck to it, first of all, with the Highway Patrol and in this profession and in that environment. But not only stuck to it, but thrived and were very successful. So with that, what would you, after your formal career in law enforcement, because you still do a lot with law enforcement, what would you say are the one or two things that you're the most proud of, or your biggest successes that bring you the most pride just to you, that you were part of or that you were able to accomplish in the Highway Patrol?
I would say being able to use my gifts, my God-given gifts, truly. I mean, I don't know that I knew what my purpose was for a long time. And sometimes for me, when I navigate things and I'm not purpose-driven, I can be very frustrated. I can feel lost in what I'm doing. I don't know my reasoning for, getting up every day and donning the uniform and dealing with the pressure. The pressure of feeling like I have to be perfect, the pressure that I have to perform, just all of that. So what I found most rewarding was the ability to be able to help other people inside the department. Because our focus when we don the uniform oftentimes is outwardly focused, how we're going to go out and provide that service and protect and serve, because it's on every patrol car in some fashion. But what I realized is that we can't do that work without the people that we work with. And the people we work with are coming to us with their own experiences that they're having outside of putting on the uniform. And I found that I would be a counselor, I would be a coach.
Because they have to be healthy, too, to be able to do a good job,
They got to be healthy, too. But they also have aspirations for where they want to go in this journey of their own. But a lot of times we don't have great pathways for them to figure that, the pathway is mucky, it's muddy, they don't know. And so I found that while I had to lead people and also give direction based on, protests or whatever we're doing, they also were navigating life, and they needed to, find ways to promote. And so when I look back, and the beauty of how it works is you never know really what you're doing while you're doing it until much later.
Right.
And I had somebody who recently promoted to one of the very highest levels of the organization just really thanked me for how much I invested in them, but more so how I changed the quality of life for not only them, but for their family. So those implications on when we give time to people and we really see them and we help them, it changes everything for them and generationally for them and their family if we do it right.
Right.
And to me, that's probably been my biggest reward, is how that happened for people. And I was able to be that advocate and be used to do that. And that's why I still do that even after retiring.
You know, it's interesting you say that. We had Leah Albright Bird on A Way Forward. Matter of fact, her podcast was recently released, and she was sucked into human trafficking as a young teenager. And one of the things she said surprised me, and I'm not sure why it surprised me, but I think it would surprise most people. She said, and you can imagine her relationship with law enforcement, being arrested and going through all those things, being in the world of human trafficking. She said what she learned is that officers have some very similar traumas that she had with all the things officers see throughout their careers. So it's interesting you say today that one of your biggest successes, you feel, is helping people inside the department. So I have a couple follow-up questions on the mentorship aspect of your career and your life. But I want to go back to your mom. I'm curious, what did your mom think at like graduation? What was your mom's reaction when you were successful in completing the academy?
Well, there was a lot of tears, and just, I think, mostly pride. And you know, my mom has passed now for many, many years, and she wasn't a big communicator on her life. My understanding of her life were my observations, and then later being filled in and informed by my aunts to share things that my mother didn't share with me at that time. But I think great pride, and probably the pride rooted in the fact that I may not, unknown at that time for her completely, but I may not have to deal with the struggles that she did as she was moving through her own life, because I was set on a different path of service that was grounded in something like law enforcement, you know, and it's a noble profession. And so when you look to that, that pride is different, I feel, for her, that Jonni's going to be okay. You know.
Good.
You know, that's what I feel anyway.
Right. So you mentioned helping others in the department. So, like, what advice would you give with all this that you have gone through and been successful in the world of law enforcement and elsewhere to a young person today that is thinking about law enforcement? Because we're currently in an environment where officers are leaving the profession in droves, probably more so than I've ever seen in my entire career. And the people coming into law enforcement is dramatically less than it was when you and I applied.
Right.
So if there is a young person that is maybe even just slightly thinking, I wonder about law enforcement, or even specifically the highway patrol, what advice would you give that young person?
Well, first of all, before I think about the advice I would give, I want to lean into the change that's shifted, the social change that has shifted around the perception of law enforcement. And when you and I came on, it was a very popular, admirable thing to do, almost like you were joining the military, but you were joining your local law enforcement. And there's been a lot of social change that have shifted that perception. But I also want to challenge law enforcement and other leaders to we can talk about the truths that are out there, but we have to be careful how we talk about truths, because it doesn't encompass every single individual. When we say and continue to tell our police professionals that you are under attack, that the community, does not like you, they hate you, we have to gear up and be defensive and go out there and be armored. When, if you were to take a sampling of people, depending on where you took the sample from, you might find very much so that a large majority of the population still feels the very same way that they did for us, but it's not amplified. It's not magnified. It's not going to be on the media because that doesn't drive the news. It's not going to necessarily be on in the narrative all the time because that doesn't evoke the emotion that we want and create what my daughter calls drama, right? So we have, things to, keep us all bunched up about. And so I'm overly encouraged. So I am a professor at the University of San Diego, and I teach.
Still working.
And I teach through a graduate program for law enforcement and public safety leaders, where we talk about emerging trends and issues that are going on, and how they're struggling with these conversations with their teams and their people around morale, job satisfaction, engagement, which has everything to do with recruitment and retention. And we talk about a lot of things, but what I discover is we don't execute a lot of things. And so that becomes the challenge. So when we're looking at recruiting young people, to them I would say, what are you doing if you are interested in law enforcement to learn more about it, to become informed and educated? So for example, I'm also adjunct at San Joaquin Delta's Post Academy, where these are individuals interested in being in policing, going through an actual academy. And then you have programs like at Sac State, where you can be in the Leads or the Scholars program, where you can get your college units, be exposed to different law enforcement agencies, learn the different classifications.
Learn the real deal instead
Learn
of
the
just
real
what you see
deal.
on TV on chips.
Instead of versus just what you hear. Now it's like on Snapchat, Instagram,
right.
Twitter. Those are all pieces of information. But you can learn to understand what classifications are in policing, what it actually calls for in policing, and you can also decide if it's going to be good for you early on, and to learn what are the factors, what are those variables that remove you from being competitive in a process. It very well, you may feel it could be your race and your gender, but when we look at your background, what have you been doing? You need to know what is not acceptable if you're going to choose law enforcement. If you're going to choose law enforcement, you have to lead a lifestyle that's very different than your friends and your peers. Do I believe there's space for law enforcement agencies to re-audit and look at policies, processes, and procedures that we filter people through? Yeah, we have to adapt. We have to have flexibility. We cannot stay the way they were when they hired us today, because that does not work. The conversation about education and creating and leveling up our professionalism by requiring education, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but you need to have some flexibility in what that looks like and what that can be a formulation of. But also, where are we looking for these young people at? We often look for them in college and universities, which is good. We look for them at sporting events. We look for them, maybe in high school, but we don't really have anything where we start where they're maybe 11 or 12. They're in their tweens, is what they're called, where you start to formulate, not only do we admire police and there are heroes and firefighters, but we're not educating, informing them, and exposing them to how they can become one, or why they should, the why for their service or their heart of interest. Right. We do one and dones. We do events, but we don't have programs anymore. And so I feel like there's a space for young people. Yes, you need to inform and educate yourself and get exposed, and here's some ways. But also agencies, we don't get in the community like we need to. We step into the community, and then we step back into the office. We step into the community, and we step back into the office. We forget that the community is an asset. They're a bridge for us to be able to build the relationships that we need for people to want to have interest and buy-in to policing.
And last question before we get to something that you're doing now. Along those same lines, I don't think there's too many days where you can turn on the TV and watch the news, if that's what you do. I've even seen it on the channel that I try to only watch, ESPN, and it even comes on there at times. Is something about law enforcement, defund law enforcement, get rid of law enforcement, some along the same things that you had just mentioned. What do you think we as a society, not just law enforcement, but we as a society, law enforcement, communities, need to do to be able to improve the level of trust and partnership and cooperation between law enforcement and the communities that law enforcement serves?
Well, that's a big question. I
That's
mean,
the $1 million question.
it's the $1 million question. It's the $1 million question. You know, a lot of things agencies are doing are really good things, and it's expanding. Community engagement practices are growing. You know, relational policing is, you know, kind of at the root, and it's growing and understanding relational policing. Chief Victorian out of Waco, Texas, speaks on this quite a bit, and it's powerful when you're thinking about relational policing in that aspect. But so I think of law enforcement a little bit differently, especially now that I've retired and I'm moving into an academic space where I'm growing my knowledge in a different way. And I'm looking at us organizationally and how we're the structures, the frames around the organization in which we work. But we don't think like a corporate business does. We still think like policing agencies almost from the early 1900s. We still function that way, even though we are multi-billion-dollar agencies for some of us. And we have so many resources and assets. But we still don't understand the importance and the value of investing and developing programs that place us in the community in collaboration. We do, again, coffee with the cop. We do different things like this that don't allow us to really understand. So I would encourage agencies, if they could, do you have a research and development department? People who are looking at evidence practices on how to collaborate that aren't your officers working in research and development. Are you outsourcing to really hire and bring in people who maybe have worked with big corporate companies to help you to know how to increase your community collaboration and your partnerships? Because the community is an asset. Right. The community has scholarship for you. There are lessons to be learned from the people and individuals in the community that we just don't know. So I recall you doing listening sessions when you were chief at SAC PD, and I had an opportunity to sit in on those because I was part of IACP's Human and Civil Rights Committee. You weren't allowed to be in the room, but we were with the community. And we were thinking we were going to hear these very big, you know, things that were concerning the community.
Just simple stuff, huh?
It was very simple. The simplicity of availability and accessibility to their police department, to their officers working the road. How approachable are they? How responsive are you? So collaboration isn't always complex.
Doesn't sound like rocket science, right?
It doesn't.
They just want a human, just basic human
They
stuff.
want to be involved. So if you're talking about reducing crime and, you know, working with youth so they can have better opportunities and keep them out of the pipeline to prison, and helping our homeless, you know, challenges that we have. When we look at root cause for social issues, it's really not that complicated. But what are your wraparound services? Right. You know, are you looking at the root of why certain communities don't trust you certain ways? Because
there's history there.
There's history there,
yeah.
Right? And, you know, but we also understand generations change some of the history within the community, right, as well as in policing. But we keep wanting to fit one to the other, but we're not quite matching it up. So to me, it just takes good people, finding the right people to help you to find those evidence-based strategies that are working and implement them. But don't make them the flavor of the month, the flavor of the year. Actually make them part of your DNA for your department and your agency. And if it doesn't work, try it a little bit. And if it doesn't work, get rid of it, but try something new. Be willing to just be evolving and be outside the box. Stop being police. I don't mean to say that in a bad way. Stop being police and be human. What do people need? What do humans need for connection and for us to actually create the change we're looking for? And so be out of the box.
Amen to that. And I might add that just recently you facilitated a Noble meeting in our region, and you're very involved with Noble, who works on bringing qualified people into law enforcement, but also works on that relationship between law enforcement and the community. So I want to end on this. You stopped being in formal law enforcement, I guess I could say, and then you did this thing like where you became an author, and you wrote a book that's called Black, White, and Blue, Surviving the Sifting. So talk a little bit about why did you do this and what is the purpose of the book?
Well, I think a lot of us, whatever our stories are in our journey and our position, we carry like this story inside of us. And we have this idea that, man, I want to write a book, right? So I've carried this in my spirit probably for 25 years. But I was ashamed of a lot of me. Remember I told you I had to get out of my own way? So I was like, I'm not worthy to write a book. I'm not qualified to write the story. And I had a woman who reached out to me. She was doing her dissertation, and she wanted to interview me for her dissertation. And so we got on a call, and it was probably about 45 minutes or an hour, and she had this list of questions, but she simply asked me the first question.
And that was it.
And she just proceeded to listen to me. And I would check in. I'm like, she goes, no, keep speaking. And when we got done, she said, Chief, I just want to tell you, you inspired me so much by your story. She said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, well, actually, I have. I just haven't gotten around to it.
I can't get out of my own way.
Yeah, I haven't gotten around to writing it. And she goes, well, you absolutely have to. And she goes, I'm going to send you something. So she sent me something to inspire me. And she goes, your book doesn't have to be complex. It just has to be your story. And so what she sent me, I read it, and I was like, wow, if they can write that and do that, why can't I? Mm-hmm. And so I decided to frame my book around the fact that she interviewed me and begin to tell my story. And I wrote it because I wanted to inspire people, human people. So when I went to want to publish it, I was told, oh, well, you're talking about God in there. You're talking about too many personal things. You need to stick to leadership principles, and we can add a little
Don't do what you want to do.
Don't do what you want to do. And I was like, but it's been in my spirit for so long that it's supposed to touch not just people in uniform, but people, because our human experience is what we carry with us all the time. And so it is about my life. It is about leadership. It is about those lessons that I've learned along the way. It's about being a woman. It's about being a person who struggles just like everybody else, has a funky, dysfunctional, childhood, and has a dramatic, funky, dysfunctional life. But somehow I'm able to lead.
Help many.
And able to survive the sifting process that takes place over that course of my life. And it's around my faith. And my belief is that it will inspire, encourage, and help other people and give them hope that, you know what, if I could do it, you can too.
Which I'm sure there'll be plenty of people won't have your exact story, but will find portions of your story that matches theirs and say
Absolutely.
that very thing. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is that there was people that say you shouldn't write this book, or you can't write this book, or you can't write it this way, similar to what people said before you applied to the Highway Patrol and throughout your career, and you did it anyway. And I'm literally holding the book, so clearly you did it anyway.
I
and
did
you did
anyway.
it your way, in a way that you think will help other people. So last question for you. Not if, because I'm sure there's plenty, are listening to this and you inspire them in some way, how can they get a copy of Black, White, and Blue, Surviving the Sifting?
Well, there's several ways. So it is on Amazon, and you can also go to my book website, which is me, www.jonnyreddick.com. That's me. But also it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's out there in the world. And if you do and you are inspired, please leave a review.
Yes.
And you can also reach out to me. I'd love that, actually.
Wow. All right. So Amazon, or go to your website. So Jonni, I've known you for a long time, and I actually didn't know all of your story that you shared today. I assumed it was somewhat similar to some of the things you've said today, because I know many women in law enforcement and I know their stories. So I assumed you've probably had some of those same challenges. But I've known you for many years. You've inspired me, and I know you've inspired other people, and I know you will continue to inspire other people, not just in law enforcement. So thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your story with folks. I really, really appreciate all that you've done and continue to do.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I think I mentioned it to you before. You were one of those folks that were a model and a mentor for me too. And I think we don't realize that when we're out there walking the talk, and we're actually living out what we're supposed to be. And then again, I believe that's our gifts and talents, and we're out there to help and serve, that we're there for one another. We have to see each other. And I just thank you for that. So
Thank you. And I'll end on this. I appreciate that you brought up your friend's family in Bakersfield, because I'm a firm believer in my own life. My mom, being adopted, I believe saved my life. And there's no reason why she needed to adopt me, that she chose to do that. And in your story, here's a family, they didn't need to do what they did for you. And yet so many times we see young people not allowing people to speak into their lives and to help them.
Right.
And it seems like every single person I talk to has a story where somebody helped them achieve their dreams or their goals. And so I'm so glad you brought that up about the family that helped you, because we need to allow people that want to help us. And I think we look at very successful people and think that, I can't do that. Well, all of those successful people had somebody that helped them. They didn't do it on their own.
And we just didn't arrive at the success.
Right.
It was a process.
Right.
So trust your process.
Yes.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jonni. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
One of the big purposes of A Way Forward is to hear different voices and different opinions, because that is how we can make informed decisions ourselves. So if you are someone that would like to come on A Way Forward to express your opinion, go to chiefhahn.com/podcast. Chief, HAHN.com/podcast.